We've the last 4 weeks we've been talking about the Mass. We're concluding with the concluding rites is the last part of the Mass. So this is the shortest of the 4 parts. I've heard a story about a priest in a parish who had a problem. His parishioners, too many of them, were leaving Mass early. Many were coming up the communion line and receiving the Eucharist, and then walking down the aisle and out the door, right into their car. And so the priest was very disturbed by this. So he would preach about it, he would talk about it, invite people to stay, how important it is to stay and reflect and stay to the end of Mass. Didn't really work out. People were still doing it. They weren't listening. So he put a sign above the door that people could see on their way out. And the sign said, "Remember, Judas left the Last Supper early too." We talked about how when you go to someone's house for dinner, that same kind of structure follows the Mass. How we show up and we're greeted, we're introduced to people, and then we sit down together and share stories. We share the good word. That's the liturgy of the word. And then we go to the table. That's the liturgy of the Eucharist. Well, certainly one would not finish their last bite of food and put their fork down and get up from the table and walk out the door and leave without saying thank you or anything. Like, if you did that, you probably wouldn't be invited back. So, the time after communion that we've been given, is used to reflect on what we've experienced, to reflect on what we've received, how God has blessed us, how God has touched our hearts during this Mass, during this celebration. And most importantly, the time to give thanks, to say thank you to God. And that's the prayer after communion, expresses that. You know, I've been asked several times by people recently, over the last few weeks, when is the right time to sit down after I've received communion? Many people want to know, when do we go from kneeling to sitting? And the answer is there is no answer. There's no prescribed time in the general instruction for the Roman Missal. It's a matter of personal preference, a matter of private devotion. So it's customary in many places that after the Eucharist is reposed and the tabernacle door is closed, many people will sit down. But some people remain kneeling while the deacon or the priest is purifying the vessels and clearing the altar. That's okay too. It's really up to you. It's a matter of personal preference. As long as we're, again, giving thanks, reflecting, expressing reverence in our own way. We don't want to be rigid about postures, but we do want to honor the real presence of our Lord among us. So there's an answer to that question, which really isn't an answer, and will probably disappoint some people. But, when the deacon or the priest says, "Go in peace," the Mass is ended. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. The Latin phrase for that is ite missa est. And it means, go forth. You are sent. You are dismissed. And that word missa, if from that we get the word mission. And we also get the word Mass itself. The word Mass itself comes from that part. Isn't that interesting? That, of all the words that we could have chosen to describe, to title what we do here, our Eucharistic worship, that we choose that, the going forth, the sending forth to love and to serve the Lord. So now that Mass is concluded, we're sent forth to the people who aren't here, and the people who are here that we see throughout the week, but we're sent to the poor, and we're sent to the sick, and we're sent to people that don't feel that they need to be here. One of the remarkable things about the last 4 weeks, we've been reading through John chapter 6, the great Eucharistic teaching, the Eucharistic discourse of Jesus. And Jesus has given us some of the most sublime truths and teachings in the whole Bible about how his flesh is true food and his blood is true drink, and whoever eats his flesh and drinks his blood will live forever. Wow. You would think that after that teaching, oh gosh, the word spread and people came from all over and the crowds grew in number, right? No, actually the opposite happened. People left. They were confused. They didn't believe it. So they left his company. Disciples, we're told in the gospel today, returned to their former way of life. 2,000 years later, it's still the case. Only 25% of Catholics regularly practice their faith. Only 25% of Catholics, some statistics show, receive the sacraments regularly. And in some places in the world, it's even lower than that. A smaller percentage of Catholics believe in the real presence of the Eucharist. So that lack of understanding, that lack of belief before this great mystery, before this great teaching is still there. And to those who stay away, to those we are sent. To them we are sent. Ita missa est, go forth, bring the gospel to them, bring the good news, bring hope to them. At Holy Trinity, a parish I was at 2 assignments ago in Fairview Heights. Some of you, I'm sure, have been there. My friend, Father Ray Schultz, when he built the church 20 years ago or so, he put a sign above the door. Now, it's not like the sign I talked about earlier. This is a more charitable sign. The sign, you can see it as you come in. There's an inscription on both sides of it. As you're walking through the door and into the church, it says, called to worship. And then as you're leaving the church, on the other side of the sign, it says, sent to serve. I think that as we conclude our thoughts on the Mass, that encapsulates our worship here about as good as you can. We're gathered, we're called to worship, and we're sent to serve. We simply don't leave the Mass returning to the routine of our lives as if nothing happened. We leave the church renewed and inspired and nourished and transformed. And the concluding rites empower us, allow us to go forth, to give what we've received to all we meet, and that is Jesus Christ. That is our baptismal call, and that's why we end the Mass before we're sent with that final blessing. We end with our sign of the cross. Again, we conclude with the reminder of our baptism. That is our baptismal call, to take Jesus, to receive Jesus, and to take him out into the world, to share God's love as we go forth from this place. That's what the concluding rites are about. So let us remember that. Let us resolve to bring God's love to others as we reflect on the Mass, as we reflect on how God calls us to worship and sends us to serve.